During this presentation, you will learn how the prevalence of small aperture downlights have affected installation and maintenance, and what you need to know to navigate these changes. The Downlight Dilemma, estate inspector requirements for downlight access and hard ceilings. This section will not be providing certificates for CEUs. However, for self-reporting, please note today's presentation will earn you 0.5 credits. Our two speakers today are Leah Robinson and Rudy Barber. Leah Robinson is a senior lighting designer for Pivotal Lighting Designs, the architectural lighting studio within Affiliated Engineers. Over the past 2 decades, Leah has worked extensively on higher education and healthcare projects for the state of North Carolina, as well as public and private institutions in the region. Leah is a licensed engineer and lighting certified by the NCQLP. Leah serves as the current IES Raleigh section president for the 2021 year and held various positions within IES. Rudy Barber is the president, Specification Sales at Team Lighting. He has been in this role for the past 10 years. Previously, Rudy owned Barber Electric Co, and an office, industrial, and high-end residential electrical contractor. Prior to that, Rudy was a commercial real estate broker, 10 years specialized in office, industrial, and land leasing sales. Rudy has served as the past IES Raleigh section president and held various other positions within IES. Without further delay, let me turn it over to Leah.
Hello, everyone. Let's see, we're live, so we're working out a couple of the logistical issues, and I think, Christine, you've passed on control.
I am passing it to presenters.
Okay. So where's the, yeah, I'm like, oh, here.
I'm in your way.
Okay, here we go. Share screen. We want to share this screen.
Screen two. No.
Oh, we want to share
PowerPoint. Yeah.
There we go. Everybody should see our opening slide here for the Downlight Dilemma. Discussion of access spurred by the Office of State Construction. So without further ado, let's get to it. And as I say that, okay. So our objectives. We want to recognize conditions for which access may be compromised. For the purposes of this discussion, we are talking, let me do this. We are talking about hard, inaccessible ceilings. So, that's kind of the underlying assumption here about our conversation. Identifying product features to support appropriate access, understand installation requirements necessary for approval, and discern risks to manufacturers, sales reps, distributors, contractors, and specifiers. The problem is that now that we have a prevalence of smaller aperture downlights on the market, we are, noticing, or we're finding in many projects that I've been working on that the state construction inspection team is re-examining luminaire access and hard ceilings. So while this is not a new issue, it is gaining more of scrutiny due to the prevalence of smaller aperture downlights. So the plan review team has to this point relied on access requirements as defined by NEC and UL and has not addressed this in the electrical guidelines.
I felt like I rushed a little.
Christine, mute yourself.
So sorry.
She's muted. So state construction practices and interpretations often filter down to local jurisdictions. Once they get wind of things. So even if you don't work on state construction projects, this could affect your project. So first off, what are we talking about? What are we talking about accessing? So of course we have the light module. We want to be able to replace this because unlike, 5 or 10 years ago, we know they do not last forever. We also want to be able to replace the driver because we know that is likely to be the first thing to fail. And we need to be able to access the wiring within the junction box. And in the case of, like I said, in a hard ceiling, there could be other junction boxes that need to be accessed from that aperture that is allowed by the NEC. So the traditional means of access, just to review, is once you pull out your, light engine assembly, your reflector, and the light engine assembly, then you basically need to pull the door down on your junction box where your driver is attached or formerly a ballast. Pull that through the aperture, and then you also need to be able to reach up into that through that aperture to the junction box in order to make connections or remake connections in some cases. And you need to be able to have a visual line of sight to that junction box. And I just want to point out that regardless of whether or not the literature you have for a 6-inch downlight versus a 4-inch downlight, that I found from many manufacturers that the installation and maintenance, or maintenance if you get it, the literature is basically the same, and it's kind of scant on the details. So it's a first place to look, but it's not always going to be the most reliable in terms of getting the answers you need about the access. So just to kind of illustrate a point, I kind of very, very simplistically modeled the lower reflector of a downlight as a half sphere. Don't give me calls about this. I know it's not a sphere, but just to give you an idea of what kind of difference in volume we're talking about, basically the volume of a half sphere that's 4.5 inches in diameter, because that's typically the size of a 4-inch downlight, is actually a 4.5-inch diameter aperture, is less than half of the volume of a 6-inch diameter aperture. So there's a lot less room to maneuver. And then if you're looking at sight lines in past to that junction box that's typically sitting over on the side, I mean, you're cut off at certain angles where you're going to be able to get a much better view in that 6-inch. You might even be able to get your eyes up into the aperture maybe, but definitely not going to happen with the 4-inch size downlight. So now, of course, 4-inch downlights aren't anything new. We've had 4-inch downlights on the market before in legacy sources. So why this is becoming an issue now, I can't really tell you, other than they were pretty uncommon to have smaller than a 6-inch downlight in the past. Whether it be because of the lower efficacy, you couldn't get a large enough lamp. I can't tell you, because I have used them way back. I had a project where I had some 4-inch square downlights, but it was definitely the exception and not the norm. Whereas in design today, it's gotten to be an industry standard. So looking at what we can rely on as for a definition of accessible. So, we're looking to the NEC, and in Article 100, there is a definition for access, and there's a couple of them depending on the context of the situation. And as applied to wiring methods, it basically says, don't break anything. You can't break your building. You can't destroy finishes trying to get at the junction box. So it's kind of wide open there. And what the NEC doesn't really tell us is a specific working clearance. Unlike equipment access, it's not telling you how many inches or millimeters or centimeters, whatever you want to go with in metric. It's not telling you how much space you need to be considered accessible. It's not telling you how much time it takes. I think, well, if you can get at it, even after an hour of sweating and cussing, is that still accessible? So in terms of the NEC, it would seem that could be interpreted pretty widely. So let's look at what UL tells us about accessible. So in UL Standard 1598, which applies to luminaires, there's a couple of instances cited here where I kind of picked out the highlights. One being that a 1 3/4 inch diameter rod should be able to pass through the aperture and reach, the destination, which would be the junction box, in order for it to be considered accessible. And then access for visual inspection is, if you got a 6-inch aperture, it's done. It's considered to be visual, your visual inspection of your junction box by the text of 1598 12.6. If you've got 6 inches or above, you're good. there's a mathematical relationship to determine whether or not a smaller aperture under 6 inches, that junction box would be considered accessible. So one of the conclusions here, okay, so we're thinking if it's UL 1598 listed or tested to, you know, third-party tested to UL 1598, we're good, right? That should do it. Well, unfortunately, that still depends. Because first off, if you want to actually get the standard, they're kind of expensive. I looked it up and you could get a copy of UL 1598 for the bargain price of $934. So that's an investment for most people, for most firms even, that's kind of an investment in one document just to be able to dissect and kind of inspect for the criteria that you might need to, that you want to adopt into a specification. Also, the cut sheet, manufacturer's cut sheets rarely actually list that they're even listed to 1598 for one thing. But there's also multiple varied compliance paths. If you read even the excerpt that I was able to get a hold of, it reads kind of like a choose your adventure novel, where, you know, you get the if and the then and the or the unless. And so there could be multiple compliance paths, and there could be compliance paths that get you to a listing, but don't necessarily guarantee access or accessibility of the luminaire for service and inspection. The scope actually applies to all luminaires for non-hazardous locations for 600 volts or less. So that's a lot to pack into a UL standard. So the conclusion is that you need to do your homework. As a specifier, you need to really understand the product, get the samples, try to get yourself into a situation where you can, you know, whether it's hanging off the end of a table or if you've got a way to support it overhead, try to see if you can access it. Because if you can access it as a specifier, like if I can access it, I'm not, you know, in any way, shape, or form a trained electrician. I'm lucky to be alive maybe, but based on things I've done at home. But if I could get in there and actually access the wiring and be able to look up into the aperture and see the junction box, then that really helps you understand that a trained electrician should be able to do that. So with that, I will turn it over to Rudy, and I'll pass you the keyboard.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Everybody's having a good day. So we've kind of gone over what accessibility is and isn't. And I'm going to kind of go over, you know, things that maybe I can help with as an electrician, as you know, what I've done in the past, and maybe my 2 cents, whether it's right or wrong. So we got this compliance path. So evaluate product accessibility, like Leah said. Evaluating the application challenges. You know, where is this fixture going? Because again, you know, we've been discussing hard ceilings, but all this goes out the window if you have, you know, access to that hard ceiling. Do you have access doors? Do you have room above? Do you have a catwalk? Is it a drop ceiling? Is it next to is it a cove, a hard ceiling, or not a cove, a soffit that's next to a drop ceiling, where you can easily access the junction box and parts of the fixture. So I think what we're trying to, you know, answer for the architects and engineers out there is, you know, we got to be aware of where you're putting these fixtures, because that's going to really dictate the scrutiny you're going to get from SCO as far as accessibility. And then also, let me go back one. Under the detail, the installation, you know, Lee and I have been talking about how, as specifiers, we can get the word to the contractors that are bidding the jobs and they're installing the jobs. How can you help them as specifiers? And one of the ways you can do that is, you know, provide details, I guess, on how these products are supposed to be installed. One of the other ways, you can use only traditional 6-inch downlights. I know the architects of the world probably don't want to hear that because they like to use the smaller apertures, and smaller apertures, with the advent of LED, smaller apertures are available. I mean, you can get the same performance out of some 2 and 3-inch LED downlights that you can out of a 6 or 8-inch downlight these days. So it really makes for a quieter ceiling and architectural detail. Some of the other things that you can do to comply is use remodel or / retrofit LED application, LED fixtures in your hard ceilings. And basically what that gets you is the ability to pull everything out through the aperture, through the hole in the ceiling. The junction box, the whip, the driver, everything comes out through the ceiling. And that really solves pretty much all your problems. One of the other things is a removable JBox or a junction box housing, and we're going to go through these next slides. Position dependent junction boxes. These are the types of things that me as a rep and the other reps that are on this call can go over with their specifiers to make sure that they're compliant with SEO requirements. So this is kind of a typical detail of a remodel fixture where during construction, the electrical contractor can have his whip up in the ceiling. They come in, they put the sheetrock up. He comes and uses a template to cut his hole out, reaches up there and gets his flexible whip, pulls it down, makes his connections, and then everything goes back up through the junction, through the hole in the ceiling cutout. That gets you access to pretty much everything that you need to have access to. Now, there's some cons to this type of product. And one of the cons is that if you have multiple downlights in a room that require through wiring, because SEO also has a requirement that they don't want any more than a 6-foot fixture whip, which is a flexible conduit.
There's some people, you let some people in.
Oh, wait a minute, where are we at?
Let's say, it looks like there's some people who need to be admitted. Admit all.
Admit all, sorry, people came in late. So again, these applications will work, but it may not work in every application, if that makes sense. And we'll get into that in a few minutes.
And one thing just to add, one of the drawbacks of remodel style luminaire remodel type is that your models are limited. So for the specifiers out there, you might not be able to get the beam spread you're looking for. You might not have the same output options or trim finish, or maybe you're looking for something that's adjustable or a wall wash. You might not have the same flexibility of options there.
Yeah, and one other thing too that I'm going to make sure I address during this presentation is the difference between a remodel luminaire and a retrofit luminaire.
Just point over. Yeah, they can't see that version.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I was on the wrong screen. I'm having technical difficulty. Okay. There we go. So this would be an example of a removable JBox, which would have a traditional frame like you would normally see in a standard can. But if you'll notice, the junction box just has a little spring clip on it, and it all comes out through the aperture. So now you have access to everything. The driver, of course, you've already removed your LED array or your module and your reflector, and you're basically pulling everything down through the aperture, very similar to a remodel can. Now, as Leah mentioned, the removable JBox type fixtures are somewhat limited by manufacturer. It depends on the manufacturers out there. Do they have this option? But what it does give you is it does give you typically the same amount of options that you would get in a traditional downlight, from lumen output to beam spreads, et cetera, reflector finishes, et cetera. So just another example of a JBox housing where everything comes down through the housing for your connections are made, and then everything would go back up through the aperture. And there's no need for, accessibility, because the only thing left in the ceiling is the frame. This would be an example of a position-dependent JBox or fixture, which basically is you have your aperture here, but this JBox actually slides on a rail. So you can easily reach up, slide the JBox over, and then with the twist of a little thumb screw, everything comes out through the bottom. Easily seen. There's no danger of reaching up in there blindly. Everything is seen from below and removable from below. And again, a lot of these slides we're showing already show the LED array or module being removed. And then maybe some other innovations out there that nobody's thought of yet. But I would encourage, especially the reps on this call, to talk with their manufacturers about, if you're thinking about coming out with a fixture in the near future with a 1/2 inch or 5 millimeter aperture, how are you going to service that fixture? What are the other innovations they can come up with to make accessibility easier from below the ceiling and hard ceiling applications? Let's see what my next slide is. Okay, application conditions for the design team. Of course, you got aesthetic goals, use of downlights with the desired aperture, the ceiling type, the ceiling configuration. I touched on this before about, especially the architects and the engineers that are on the call. A lot of times you may not see the ceiling detail or the reflected ceiling plan. A lot of times when I see plans, I will see the E-sheets, the electrical sheets. It doesn't necessarily tell me what type of ceiling I'm dealing with. So for the specifiers that are on the call, I would encourage you to collaborate with your reps and your architects with their engineers and engineers with their architects to make sure that everybody's aware of the ceiling types where these fixtures are going. And the accessibility requirements that go along with that. Let's see here. Now, this would be application conditions for the construction team, the i.e. the general contractor, the CM, and the electrical contractor, and the ceiling, the folks that are doing the ceilings as well. Again, we're going back to these access applications. Is it going to be top access? Even though you have a hard ceiling, do you have access from above? That's just a question. The other thing that we're going to talk about in a few minutes is, do you have any other junction boxes in those ceilings that are not attached to the fixture? How are you getting your fixture whips to these fixtures? They're coming from a junction box somewhere. And as I stated before, I think you're limited to a 6-foot whip from a junction box to the fixture. So what do you do if you have a conference room, for example, that the entire ceiling is sheetrock, and you've got, like in this conference room I'm sitting in now is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, roughly 24 by 20, something like that, 10. You may have a lot of recessed can lights in here. Well, and they're going to be farther than 6 feet apart. Well, how do you get your switch leg conductors to each one of those fixtures and still comply with state construction's 6-foot whip rule? And how do you do that? So that you don't have a junction box above the ceiling that is not part of the fixture assembly, but still needs to be accessible. So this next diagram just kind of shows you a room that may have a junction box in the middle, and you're coming off of your junction box with these whips. These whips are 6 feet in length, but where is this junction box located? If it's above that hard ceiling, it is not accessible because it's not attached to this junction box that is on this recessed fixture. So I don't know how many people have seen this type of detail in the past. This detail works great if you're in an ACT grid ceiling because the junction box is accessible. So here again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but so how do you access this junction box in a hard ceiling? So next slide will be, you have the option to do through wiring. So first thing you have to decide is your fixture even rated for through wiring? Some of them are, some of them aren't. Depends on the size of this junction box and what this fixture is rated at. So now you say, well, I'll just come out of, out of my junction box that is in an accessible ceiling over here to my first fixture, and I'll jump between the fixtures. Well, how do you do that when you're more than 6 feet apart? So this will be, this is my interpretation. It does not mean it's the right interpretation. And obviously your state inspectors are going to want to jump in on this next slide here. But this is just an idea that I came up with as a former contractor to get around the 6-foot flexible conduit restriction that state construction has. And that is to transition from EMT conduit over to flexible conduit using a EMT to flex connector. That way you can through wire when you have distances that are greater than 6 feet to get between your fixtures in a hard ceiling that is not accessible. Okay. Next slide is, or you can do access doors, which nobody really likes to get to your junction boxes on your recessed lights. So this is a quote that Leah put in here. If the mountain won't come to Muhammad, Muhammad must go to the mountain. So what kind of risk do we have out there? Unsightly access panels is one because nobody likes those. If state construction inspectors come out and they find a problem, then now you might have a schedule delay. You might have change orders because the contractor is going to say, hey, you approve this fixture in the submittal. I put them up. So who's going to pay me to take it down? And then lastly, there may be open the door for litigation from somebody. And if anybody's ever been a part of litigation, they don't just sue one of you, they sue everybody and then let the court figure out who gets to go home. So nobody wants to be a part of litigation, that's for sure. Then we're going back to the access panels. They're costly, they're unsightly. They might, if you're the architect and the owner comes in and you have to tell them that you've got to provide these accesses that you didn't think you were going to have to provide before, you're probably going to have an unhappy owner. Why didn't you know this? I can't believe this is happening. Yada, yada, yada. Nobody wants that. And then we're going to go over schedule delays, liquidating damages. Are there liquidating damages on the project? Most of them do. Is this going to trigger a liquidating damage because you are now, these things typically come up when the inspector comes for final inspection and they're trying to get the building open. So that's not going to make the owner very happy if you tell him he's got to tear a ceiling down and either redo the ceiling or put in some access panels, etc., to get access. So again, you have you're damaging the reputation of the construction team, the CM, and you have an unhappy owner. Of course, then we got change orders, professional liability claims, freight, restocking fees. And as everybody, and as a rep, I want to talk about the restocking fees for just a moment. Unless it's an off-the-shelf product and once it's been installed, you're not going to get any restocking. You've bought those fixtures, you own them. You can use them on your next project in a ACT ceiling if you like. Again, damage to the reputation of the specifier and or the supply team, which is me typically, and a unhappy owner. Then, of course, where you go back to the ugly L word of litigation. Who may initiate litigation? It could be the manufacturer, because the manufacturer might say, well, my downlights are accessible. I have a UL listing, and I'm not going to replace 300 or 400 downlights for free. They may do it. The electrical contractor may do it. The general contractor could do it. The specifier, the manufacturer's rep. Basically, anybody and anyone and everybody can litigate if there's enough money at stake. And then we're going to have some questions and answer. And I would like, we're going to unmute Bob, I think, aren't we? So that we can get comments.
Yeah, you can unmute.
All right, hold on. I'm trying to figure this out, Bob. Give me a second.
There's also still a couple people in the waiting room.
Oh, well, we're done.
I know. Well, they might join the discussion.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
You're unmuted. Okay. All right.
I sent
so
you a
everyone,
message.
This is Bob Talley. He's my second favorite state employee. And I would like to, I guess, Bob, what is your actual title?
I'm
I
assistant.
don't know that I ever knew that.
Oh, I'm assistant director of the state construction office for the consulting services section.
Okay. So he sits in the big chair, in other words.
Latif's in the big chair.
Okay. Well, Bob, I would just like for you to, I know we said a lot, we had you on mute, but, if I need to go back to some other slides, you just let me know. But I would just like to, get some of your wisdom here that we've talked, many hours over many days over the past few weeks. I'd like for you to share some of that if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Well-
I've learned a word recently. It's opine. Could you opine for us, please?
No, I appreciate the involvement and letting me participate. And I did notice that Dr. Lynn Davis is on this presentation. And-
Oh, yes, he is.
Oh my gosh, y'all are lucky. You have the man who can answer everything just about for the UL specification. And it probably would be good to get him to at least say some words about how we can all get better informed about how to use the UL specifications and move through that, how to get a copy of the white book, or whether he recommends something else. But Lynn Davis is just a wealth of knowledge, and he's really quiet sometimes. And then when he says something, you realize that the mountain just moved. Okay, so there's your way to get things fixed, is let Lynn talk with us. No, I think you covered the big issues. It's not state construction's intention to rewrite the NEC. We are tasked for years and years, for decades. SCO was tasked by the legislature with making sure that the money that was being spent on state facilities was not creating Cadillacs, that it was buying just really good 100-year buildings. And when you start thinking of it that way, you can you get a feel for what we were tasked to do. We now have a dual task. We are code compliance, and is this a good expenditure of taxpayer money? And so all of the standards we wrote in the electrical guidelines were intended to provide 50 to 100-year buildings. Yes, you can build strip malls every day, but those things are typically not around for 50 years. And so it is a different construction technique when you go to a 50 to 100-year building,
Bob,
and we want to stay there.
can I jump in here for a second? Because you
Yeah.
mentioned guidelines, and I had a question here from KB Stevens about does SEO plan to publish something that everyone involved can then use to help ensure they would comply?
And that's what Rudy and I talked about earlier this week, is that the guidelines are very high level, taking into account that you already have UL standards, you already have the National Electrical Code, and you have the building code. So with all those codes out there, you don't want somebody trying to write to telling you prescriptively how to comply, and take all the choices away from folks. I don't think. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, if it was easy, anybody could do this stuff. So yeah, we as electrical designers, we have to have special knowledge, and that means really starting to understand what the NEC says in terms of access, and what UL is trying to help us do in terms of the standards. And Lynn could probably speak to this, but I've run into it recently with equipment that showed up that appeared to be listed that we think is not. And we've now spent 3 months trying to figure out what's actually wrong with it. So that's not going to be an easy thing. And so it's possible that some equipment you could actually end up on your job site could have a fake sticker that UL fights that on a regular basis. So This is not an easy task to figure out what to do.
Lynn, do you have any comments?
Yeah, you kind of been called out. We kind of.
Yeah, no pressure, right? Well, thank you, Bob, for the kind words. Let me know how much I owe you. But yeah, counterfeits are an issue. So you know, that's certainly something you want to be aware of, and that can happen. And you know, if you getting something that sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So you know, be aware of counterfeits. And you know, Bob and I have talked a lot about guidance documents versus codes and things like that. And I certainly understand where he's coming from, and the importance of following the codes and the UL standards. So certainly agree with him on that.
Hey, Lynn, Rudy here. I do have a question for you though, as it relates to these, to the UL sticker or the third-party testing facilities that are accepted in the state of North Carolina. What Lee and I have been struggling with is these UL standards that the manufacturers use to define accessibility for their fixture. So I guess what I'm trying to decide or trying to find out is if the fixture has a UL sticker, and that UL, it has a UL number that on the sticker that it complies with. How does a specifier know if that sticker complies with state construction's definition of accessibility, or if state construction says if it has that sticker, we know it complies, we're good? Because I think that, you know, we talked about that, the different paths for UL certification earlier in the slideshow. You know, I've got to call, I mean, this information is not easy to get from manufacturers, by the way. So we've gotten all these sections or paragraph out of UL 1598. So I, as a manufacturer's rep, am thinking, well, do I have to comply with all of them or just some of them? Or do manufacturers have to comply with all of them or just some of them before they are out of compliance with the definition of accessibility?
That's a good question. I think it depends on exactly what you're going for. If you're limiting it to accessibility, you know, the UL defines accessibility in a certain way, and so you certainly want to comply with that. And it's really more, the state is really more following the UL recommendations than UL is written to follow the state guidelines. So that's kind of the general rule.
Okay, so you know, with the for the reps that are on this call right now, if they go to their downlight manufacturers, and you know, because the UL says then one of their standards or one of their paragraphs says if it's not accessible from below the ceiling in some fact, I don't have it in front of me exactly, then you have to label your fixture as top access only, which is perfectly fine. It just means you can't put it in a hard ceiling. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm trying to decide is that I got to go back to all my manufacturers, and the reps that are on this call are got to do the same, and they got to say, what are your fixtures? What do they comply with? Because and knowing what to comply with in terms of accessibility. Is that?
Well, I think where you're going with this is you know, like I had in one of the slides, I'm like, if the product is UL 1598 compliant, is there a compliance path that gets you that UL listing that does not ensure access? And without, I mean, until you go, purchase it for a large sum of money, a decent investment for the pleasure of getting to dissect a bunch of if, then, or, unless, and trying to parse whether or not there's a compliance path that can get a product a listing without it meeting their requirement. Because it seems like a simple matter to go to the factory and say, is your product UL 1598 listed? And first and foremost, why the heck it doesn't say that it's listed to the UL 1598 standard on the cut sheet is beyond me.
It just says.
It just says it's listed. CSA, ETL, whatever, it's listed to, listed to a UL standard. Why can't they print 1598 on there? That's a gripe for the manufacturers. Yeah, because that's the standard they should be complying with. But again, is there a compliance path that allows them to get a listing without it meeting these requirements for access with either a top access only sticker or being accessible from below? And therein lies, I mean, that, until we can answer that question, we don't know of a surefire way as specifiers, as product agent representatives, as contractors, anybody who might suggest a product. We can't figure out if there's a way to know before getting it installed if it will comply with these access requirements. That's the problem that I know I'm having, is what is going to ensure that, other than looking at some alternative means, a non-standard means for access, such as being able to get the whole junction box out of the ceiling.
Well, and I will tell you this, with that drawing that Rudy showed a while ago, if everything flexes over to that fixture, the other end has to be accessible. You could still end up with access panels in your ceiling for that other junction box. It requires really careful evaluation. Personally, as a PE,
This one, Bob?
no, the other one that you had with
We'll keep going.
that one. Yeah, one before
one.
that one, I think is the one you showed.
Yeah.
Okay.
That if that is truly where the junction box is for the other end of the flex, wherever that is, that has to be accessible for the life of the electrical system. That's just the way the NEC is written, is that they recognize, and we are building 100-year buildings for the state. 50 years from now, we've got to get back to that point. And if somebody has put in 6 foot of flex or 8 foot of flex and they stretch it to the very limit, it's not coming down that hole. I mean, so you could still these are things that need to be carefully thought through. And as a PE, personally, I wouldn't specify a 4-inch aperture unless I know it's in a that I've got access points all around it. I just there's not enough data to me that says we're not going to have problems with the installation, and I don't need that much hassle in my life.
Well,
I'm too old
and
for
to
that.
your point, Bob, is that as a specifier and, who works on a lot of public projects, is whether it's the, I'm not always worried about code minimum anyway. So even if, let's say that UL listing conveyed some standard of accessibility for the product, if I've got, and because I've heard it before, if I've got a client who says we're having trouble maintaining it, then, well, because it's difficult, doesn't have to be impossible, but if it's difficult, then I want to, as a service to my client, provide them with a product that allows for an enhanced access at minimum. And so some of these strategies, like I said, you can apply them to other projects, regardless of, the interpretation of the inspection. You can apply them to projects to say, what is going to be a better installation for the client? Because I mean, depending on the product, it's not necessarily more expensive. I mean, it's not even a money issue. It's not like you have to pay a lot to get a product that, has a junction box that comes out. It's just a different product. It might still have competitors that are in the same price point. That's not even the issue, but for me personally, it's about being able to provide my clients with a building that they can maintain, because it's not about day one, it's about day 1,000, it's about day 10,000.
Right. Well, and the contractor, who is going to be the low bid contractor, they're not all equal. Some are willing to find a much cheaper fixture if it saves them $5 per fixture or $1 per fixture. And they will choose that fixture just seeing the dollar for some reason, and figure we're gonna fight this out later. You can have done everything as a specifier in your power and still have that happen, and all of a sudden we're in this fight at the end of it because you did not realize what the contractor had done. And it's not unusual, having been on both the private and the public side, as both a designer, I sealed a lot of drawings, and now as an inspector, it's not unusual for us to have approved something as a design, reviewed the specs and the shop drawings, and the contractor actually ordered something different. That is not, I used to think it was just my projects. I've now seen it statewide. That is not unusual. So they found something that would save them $2 a fixture after what I had approved.
But Bob, at that point though, it is now on the contractor to fix. If,
No, it's on all of us at that point because everybody wants that building. And the only person they're going to be mad at is the engineering and the architect. That's just what happens. For some reason, they don't get mad at the contractor, and the contractors know that.
I can't disagree with Bob there.
Yeah.
I mean, they know that. So at that point,
and so for the specifiers on this call, we see it every day with projects being VE'd. And so as a specifier, you're seeing, you might see these submittals come through and we got to get this done. We got to get this done. And something falls through the cracks that you now have a fixture that doesn't meet the definition of accessibility.
Well, when you get 3 different rounds of turning down those downlights, and you've turned them down 3 times or 4 times or 5 times, eventually it's coming back in and you're going to think you've seen that same one, and now it's a different cut sheet and it slides through. And that is a game. I know it's a game. So now the question becomes, is it worth your 4-inch downlight? I just moved away from it. It's like, I don't want to see that on my project. I'm not willing to fight that one because it's so hard to get it right on a public bid project. Private money, you can make anything happen.
Is there, Rudy, do you see any differences since you bring up cost? I know 4-inch downlights have become kind of industry standard, but you can still get a whole lot at 6-inch. Is there anything price-wise, availability-wise that you can think of that would make it easier to use a 4-inch versus a 6-inch? I'm just asking, is that part of the conversation?
The costs are roughly the same. I mean, the reason that you're going to the smaller apertures is just like I told, is really for aesthetics, with certain exceptions. But for most general office use, you can get the same performance out of a 2-inch as you can a 4-inch as you can a 6-inch. It's where you get into the higher lumen packages that you start running into trouble, and you typically need to go to a larger aperture. Cost perspective, it's not that big a deal.
So certainly that is an option to, like we showed, is that going to 6-inch aperture downlights is an option.
Well, yeah, and I would encourage all of y'all to think about it. I know manufacturers like the looks. I know architects like the looks, but I've been there with electricians standing on that ladder, reaching into a 277 volt ceiling mounted can. And when they are sticking their hand in there to try and figure out how to pull the ballast back out, or to try and figure out what's been up there for the last 20 years. And they're doing this, and they're trying to get their hand in there. And you ask, would you want your son or daughter to be one doing that? And we've had people fall off of ladders when they hit something that's was a problem. The building is shook for 20 years, and now they're actually holding up. They touch something that's hot in that box. 6-inch is bad enough, but a 4-inch, really? I mean, that's I just don't believe somebody's life is worth that look for an architect.
Well, Bob, I got 2 comments on that, and I know where you're going with this, but when you talk about you're looking at 50 and 100-year-old buildings, and as a contractor, you go into these old buildings, you don't know what's been rewired, you don't know if the circuits have been labeled correctly, yada yada yada. But the second comment is that most manufacturers put in the big bold type, do not service while energized. But again, to your point, you may be thinking it's off. Yep. And it's not really off because the breakers are not, they've recircuited the building 10 times in the last 30 years. And Nobody relabeled the panel like they're supposed to, even though they're required to do so, but they don't necessarily do so. So
We've
I
had
mean,
it
I've been
actually
there and done
happen.
that. I've been
Well,
there and done.
I can tell you, in the new education building, we redid one of our conference rooms for the first time with all of its LED lights. Those with LED now, those were originally screw-in fixtures installed in 1992. We drove that conference room for 27 years before we relit it. And yes, somehow people had actually changed some of the circuits over 27 years, and some that were off were not controlled out of the lighting control panel that we thought they were controlled out of. Somebody got a better idea and changed it. And now you got an electrician reaching into a circuit he thinks is off. Luckily, those were 9-inch cans, and he could see and put a wiggy in there and get some information back. But yes, I've seen it. 4-inch, I don't want folks reaching into a 4-inch.
So there are comments that I think have gone out to everyone. And, you know, let me check and see if the chat here in
Yeah,
case there were
At the
anybody.
bottom. Go to the bottom. Yeah, hover on the bottom. That's where it was when
I just wanted to make sure we were covering that. I mean, a lot of the comments I'm seeing here were to everyone, and I was trying to see if there were comments that were just coming in to the presenter. But as far as the comments coming to everyone, the you know, in case you haven't been reading, as far as getting a copy of the presentation, we're recording it. We are working out the logistics on making it available. I can certainly make the slides available. Aparna had some comments about the UL being a safety issue. Well, accessing the junction box is a safety issue, I think, and there are applicable criteria within the UL standard. So
Yeah,
if not UL, I don't know exactly what you would go by to say that the product is legal.
Yeah, and I do want to make it clear, this is just my opinion. It's not SCO opinion. So what we will approve is whatever is approved by the NEC. I mean, if the NEC and the UL standards agree that something can go in, we work with you to figure that out. Everything that I'm aware of, once we have actually said something looks wrong with this, it's either turned out to be a counterfeit product, or it's turned out to be modified by somebody, or it wasn't appropriate for the location. But the 4-inch thing, my problem with that is just my opinion. That's not an SCO opinion. That's my personal one.
I mean, you know, the designer in me says, well, the 2-inch downlights, so you can get the whole thing to come out the aperture, doesn't it, you know, you know, you don't, with a 2-inch, there's no question. Nobody's reaching up into that hole for anything. It's got to come out. That's the only way to construct the thing. So you know, with that, I mean, does that offer any significant?
Well, so you got to have some flex. Where's the other side of that flex that's coming down?
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah, I mean, it's gotta work within that.
Yeah, so it's a two-part equation.
Right.
You got the fixture accessibility, and then you've got the junction box feeding that fixture. The junction box is feeding the fixture's junction box is inaccessible.
Right.
That's
So I mean, this is a rolling thing. You can find something that gets the fixture accepted, and then you still don't have access to the under end of the fixture.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's why we wanted to bring in, I mean, it's not just about specifying the right product. As we said, you got to get the whole thing right. And so
Yes.
you know, as specifiers, we need to, you know, evaluate our product. We also need to detail the installation so that it is done in a way that will not compromise the access otherwise.
And you may be able to do it with 2-inch. You may be able to do it with 4. You may be able to do it. I mean, definitely you can do it with 6. I don't think when normally it shows up as a problem, I don't think it's been properly vetted by everybody when that happens.
Correct.
And I hate it when that happens.
And I mean, this situation here, that's not, you know, something that, you know, immune to a 6-inch, but that's the point, is that you can use a 6-inch downlight, but you're not done. You can't rest your, you know, laurels on that 6-inch. You have to get the installation right as well.
Yes, and I'm glad you're bringing that up. I think that's what folks get confused about, is that they've laid out this lights and they think they're done, and that's maybe not. Because that
I'll make
junction
a
box,
comment about having the reflected ceiling plan in conjunction with the E-sheet so that, you know, because if a specifier, and this happens to us reps all the time, a specifier calls and says, hey, I need a 2-inch downlight or a 4-inch downlight for this application. Well, okay, here you go. Well, I don't know where it's going, you know? So that's why I think we need to have these conversations is so if I see an E-sheet or an engineer may send me an E-sheet and says, oh, we're going to put downlights in this area right here. What do you recommend? Well, here you go. Here's a 4-inch from whoever, not knowing that that's going to be a, you know, metal pan ceiling with no access or sheetrock or plaster that you have no way of getting access to. So what I may have sent is not applicable to that installation.
Yep.
Right.
Hey, have you, Rudy, were you going to share with them the document that we're considering? We're floating around SEO right now about posting
I
on.
wasn't in this presentation, but we're going to share it with the IES
Okay.
membership. Yes.
Yeah, we're trying to write something that will warn everybody that to please consider, to make sure, or please make sure you've considered how your lights in these smaller apertures are going to be installed and whether you've done your coordination from your drawing perspective.
So we're over time, but I just wanted to see if there were any other burning questions. I know one here is asking if there are any other light types that are not desirable for state construction office. And I think, Bob, if there's any pet peeves, that's about as far as I think we'd get with that. But
Yeah, that's just it. And it's all about access. It's all about access, and it's keeping people safe.
okay. Amanda Brooks brings up a good point because remember there's going to be junction boxes for other than the lighting systems in the space. And I'm on hard ceiling. So I didn't cover absolutely everything, but if somebody had a burning question, if you unmute or something, I apologize if there's flags we're not getting. I'm looking at these numbers here. I haven't run Zoom calls much, so but we did it live. It was an experiment and we're seeing how it worked out. So hopefully everybody got a beneficial experience out of it and learned something new, even if it left you scratching your head a little bit. I think we all have some homework to do on this. And I really appreciate everybody's time and we'll